Welcome to Parasite Eve. This is by Hideaki Sena, translated by Tyron Grillo. Copyright 2005 Hideaki Sena. Prologue. Everything vanished suddenly before her eyes. Kiyomi Nagashima had no idea what had happened. The houses she passed every day were reflected in the windshield only a moment ago. Just ahead, the street took its familiar slope downward and bore slightly to the right, where a traffic light had just changed to yellow before her vision failed her. Kiyomi tried hard to blink, but her sight did not return. No matter how much effort she put in, nothing appeared. They had all gone away. The white sedan driving in front of her, the tail light of the bus waiting at its stop, the cluster of high school girls hastening along the sidewalk. Kiyomi looked down in her confusion to check the steering wheel. Then suddenly she was truly shocked. The steering wheel was gone. In fact, she did not even know where her hands were. She could not feel the seatbelt around her waist nor her foot on the gas pedal, for neither was where it was supposed to be. There was only darkness fanning out, continuing endlessly in all directions. There was a churning around her, and she was floating in a warm, viscous liquid. She was naked. Her clothes had vanished without her ever noticing. That dream again. That dream she had once a year on Christmas Eve, in which she felt herself writhing in some pitch-dark world without beginning or end. She'd always had that strange dream. This was the dream, and she was now entering it again. But she did not know why she was having it just now. Like the stars' orbits, the dream always came to her with regulated precision. She'd never dreamt on it any other night but Christmas, and had certainly never entered into it while she was awake. Her body was changing profoundly. She lost all feeling in her arms and legs. Maybe they'd actually vanished. Head, torso, and hips gone. A body long and narrow like a worm's she'd felt herself to be. Kiyomi shook and slithered ahead through the slightly sticky blackness. What is this place? It was a question she had asked many times before. Her body seemed to recall this place, yet no matter how much she tried, Kiyomi herself could not remember. Once, in some far-off place, Kiyomi was just like this, not understanding anything, just squirming and swimming. That much was true. Had it been yesterday, a recent year, or in the more distant past? She could not tell. To begin with, it was not clear that time flowed in this vast gloom. Kiyomi felt her body changing again. Something small divided slowly deep inside of her. At the same time, she felt a gentle constriction in her very center, and the ends of her body flowed quietly in opposing directions. She was becoming two. It was a strangely tranquil feeling. Time seemed to pass so gently, slowly. Where am I? When is this? What am I? Such mundane concerns no longer mattered. She wanted only to remain floating like this in the dark. She gradually split in half. There was no pain. Rather, she was insensate, and that was bliss. Everything sedate, no turmoil, dividing like it was natural. Calm. All was calm. Kiyomi let all her nerves relax as she slowly surrendered herself to the flow. Her vision was then completely restored, just as unexpectedly as it had abandoned her. She clearly saw now her own 2 hands grasping the steering wheel. Kiyomi blinked, then looked straight ahead. She was heading straight into a telephone pole. Part 1. Development. Chapter 1. Until the phone rang that morning, it was the beginning of an average, uneventful day for Toshiaki Nagashima. At 8:20 a.m., Toshiaki parked his car at the School of Pharmaceutical Sciences. The lot was still more than half empty. Briefcase in hand, he got out of the car and locked it. He looked up indifferently at the pharmaceutical center. Rising 6 stories high, the building was steeped in somber gray beneath the cloudy sky. In the entrance lobby, Toshiaki changed into a pair of sterile sandals, then took the elevator to the 5th floor. Double doors opened to reveal a corridor extending in both directions. Far back to the right was the lecture hall where he taught his course on advanced methods in biofunctional sciences. It appeared that most of his students and the other staff members had yet to arrive, for not a sound could be heard. However, late mornings were not unusual. The other organic science courses were quite indifferent, entire staffs assembling and seminars beginning at 8 a.m. Toshiaki's course was an exception in that they wasted no time on finding fault with their students' time management skills. Instead, he and his colleagues stressed that what mattered was for the students to conduct their experiments and present the data. As a mere research associate, Toshiaki made an effort to arrive by 8:30. But this was not a commitment required of him. He opened the door to Lab 2, which housed his desk, turned on the light, and entered. After hanging his coat, he placed his briefcase next to the bookshelf. 2 chemical agent order forms had been written up and left for him on the desk by his students the night before. Specifically, requests for the restriction enzymes ECHO-R1 and BAM-H1. Toshiaki attached the forms together with a paper clip and pinned them to the desk side wall. Looking over the notes he'd made the day before, he began to prepare for his experiment. First, he left the lab and keyed open a door just down the hall, which led to the cultivation room. The room's interior was imbued with an ultraviolet sterilizing light, which he'd switched to an ordinary fluorescent light as he stepped inside. He took 2 plastic culture flasks from the incubator and placed them under a microscope. He adjusted the focus and peered through the lenses, gazing at cells on the other end. After ensuring he was satisfied with their condition, he returned the cells to the incubator and removed a few implements from the autoclave and placed them into the clean bench. Toshiaki returned to his lab and removed several testing chemicals from the refrigerator. Just then, Sachiko Asakura, a second-year master's student he had been mentoring, walked in. "Good morning," she enunciated pleasantly as she entered. Toshiaki returned the greeting like an echo. Asakura put her coat away, revealing a figure shrouded in a white summer sweater and jeans. She had her long hair tied behind her back. Removing her sweater, she donned a white lab coat. At nearly 5'9", Asakura was quite tall for a woman, shorter than Toshiaki by only an inch or so. When she passed by, she acknowledged him with a smile and a small bow. Asakura's height was greatly accentuated in her long coat, and it was always pleasant to watch her stately figure as it fluttered about the lab during an experiment. Toshiaki informed her he would be in the cultivation room, and with that he left the lab. Once the clean bench preparations were complete, he removed the culture flasks and commenced his work. The cells he was using, known as NIH3T3, were relatively common. He had, however, introduced retinoid receptor genes into the cells of one of the flasks. 2 days before, he placed each respective cell culture into a new flask and bred them. Then, the following day, he'd added a dose of B-oxidization enzymes into the indicator solutions. Today, he planned on collecting mitochondrial data from both cultures. His expectation was that the activity of the B-oxidization enzymes would be higher for the cells receiving the gene transfer than for the control cells. Just when he began the procedure, there was a phone call. Toshiaki heard the lab phone, but his hands were occupied, and Asakura was over there in the lab. He assumed she would take the call. After 3 rings, she seemed to have picked up the receiver. For a dozen seconds, the morning's peace was restored. But soon, there was the sudden echo of rushed footsteps. Toshiaki continued working, wondering what was the hurry. Not knowing why, he chanced to glance at the wall clock. The hands indicated exactly 9 a.m. The lab door burst open. "Dr. Nagashima, you have an urgent phone call." As he lifted his gaze slowly, he saw Asakura's face in the doorway, her mouth trembling slightly. "It's from the hospital. Your wife, she's been in an accident." "What?" With that he rose. Chapter 2. The streets around the university hospital were congested. Rows of outpatient cars spilling over the public roadways. Unable to suppress his mounting impatience, Toshiaki sounded his horn furiously. The person on the phone had been a staff member from the emergency ward. Kiyomi was driving her car, he said, when for some reason she veered off a turn, crashing straight into a telephone pole. Considering how bad the wreck was, he doubted she had even tried the brakes. Kiyomi had suffered a potentially fatal impact to the head. Toshiaki asked about the location of the accident, only to discover that it was a main drag he used too. It was an easy road to speed on, but its unobstructed view made it anything but dangerous. "Damn it!" he shouted, turning the steering wheel sharply as he peeled out from the middle lane and made a U-turn. Car horns blared everywhere like pigs, but he paid no attention to them. He circled around to the hospital's back entrance, skidded into a parking area reserved for personnel, and dashed inside through a loading bay. On the way, he managed to grab hold of a passing nurse to ask where the emergency ward was. The hallway felt endless as Toshiaki ran with all the speed he could muster, his leather shoes making skittish sounds upon the linoleum floor. His lips shaped Kiyomi's name in a continuous murmur. He turned right at the next passageway, nearly knocking over an elderly woman in his haste. Noticing her at the last moment, he jerked his body around to avoid her and continued hurriedly down the corridor. He refused to believe it. What had gone wrong? Hadn't Kiyomi smiled that morning like always? Toshiaki thought of breakfast. They ate fried eggs with fish and miso soup with tofu. Not that there was anything unusual about it. It was as common a breakfast as one could imagine. A meal that implied she meant to continue their life just so. This was all too sudden. They'd left together that morning. Kiyomi was going to the post office and took her own car. She had just gotten the car, a used compact, 6 months ago, because she needed it for shopping. She liked cute things and was attracted to its red color. "Excuse me, but are you Kiyomi Nagashima's family?" Toshiaki caught his breath. An aging nurse had come running up, and she was peering into his face. Toshiaki cleared his throat, swallowed, and forced out an affirmative reply. "Kiyomi-san is in critical condition," the nurse explained. "It appears she sustained a strong impact to the head from the accident. When she was carried here, she was already hemorrhaging badly and not breathing." Toshiaki walked past and sat himself down on a couch in the hallway. He gazed at the nurse's face in blank amazement, unable to wrap his mind around what she had just said. "Can you save her?" "We've taken her straight into the operating room for emergency treatment. Her condition is serious. I would advise that you summon her relatives." Toshiaki groaned. Kiyomi's parents came at once. Her father managed a surgical clinic in an old housing district nearby and lived right next to his workplace, only a few miles from the university hospital. Both their faces were pale. Kiyomi's father asked Toshiaki how she was holding up. When he learned of her critical state, he gulped, closed his eyes, and slumped onto the couch. Kiyomi's mother, normally the epitome of unwavering composure, was badly disheveled. Concealing her face behind a handkerchief, she showered the nearby nurse with cries of anguish. Toshiaki stared blankly at the hunched figure of his mother-in-law. He hadn't expected this. He realized with a jolt that Kiyomi's parents were human beings after all. When he was invited to Kiyomi's house for the first time, Toshiaki's impression was of a peaceful, elegantly dressed family, smiling, sipping tea, enjoying each other's company, surrounded by high-class furniture. Her father was an easygoing and reliable man, and her mother, while reserved, wore an inextinguishable smile. He had always thought them perfect, like a family one might see on TV. He could hardly picture the couple before him now as the comfortably tranquil pair they had always presented themselves to be. Theirs now was a show of raw emotion. "Calm down." Toshiaki's father-in-law chided his wife, but he was unable to mask the trembling in his voice. She turned around with a start, her eyes wide open. Then, Letting out a great sob, she leaned her body brokenly into her husband's. It was well past noon, but they had no appetite. They relocated to the waiting room at the nurse's suggestion and sat down, staring absent-mindedly at the clock. The nurse came occasionally to update them. By applying massage, they had been able to restore Kiyomi's respiratory function, but she was lapsing into gasping fits and was now on a respirator. After undergoing some CT scans, she had been moved to the intensive care unit. After 30 long minutes, a doctor finally came in. They all rose from the couch. The man wore glasses and had a certain aura of frailty. He was still young, probably in his early 30s, but his facial features were chiseled and his eyes gentle. Toshiaki had a good feeling about him. The doctor introduced himself as a brain surgery specialist. He turned his face almost defiantly towards them and explained everything in the most sincere tone. Kiyomi-san was suffering from a serious cerebral hemorrhage. As soon as she was brought to our ward, we operated on her brain and attempted to resuscitate her heart and lungs. She's breathing now with the aid of a mechanical respirator. She has lost the capacity to breathe on her own. We will continue to medicate her with heart stimulants and keep a close eye on her. However, she is in a deep coma right now. It's extremely regrettable for me to have to tell you this, but she is heading towards brain death. Kiyomi's mother hid her face to smother the pain-stricken voice that escaped from her mouth as a strange "ah." Toshiaki did not know how to respond. Terms like medical respirator, deep coma, and brain death coiled into a vortex in his head. He could hardly believe that his beloved wife was being described in such terms. Suddenly, Toshiaki sensed heat. He looked up. His body felt hot, like it was on fire. The room hadn't gotten any warmer. It felt more like he'd ignited from within. The temperature shot up. Unsure of what was going on, Toshiaki looked around him, but his vision, clouded with crimson, was soon gone. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a dry rasp came from his throat. The back of his throat had vaporized. Flames would rise from his fingertips at any moment. He was going to burn, he thought. He was about to start burning. What will happen to her? The heat left him. His mother-in-law was interrogating the doctor. We are monitoring her brain waves, blood pressure, and heart rate. If the blood flow to her brain stops, she will start losing brain cells. We are performing CT scans to monitor the situation. After reviewing the results, we will examine whether brain death has occurred. Toshiaki could hardly tell where the doctor's voice was coming from. He blinked. He saw a hand. It was his left hand. He tried closing and opening it and saw that his fingers were moving. They did not flare up as he had half feared. By the time he came to his senses again, Kiyomi's mother had drawn near to her husband, and the doctor was informing them that the first brain death examination might have to be conducted that evening. Toshiaki felt dizzy and sat on the couch, still reeling from his hallucination. There was a throbbing in his temples. "Are you okay?" said the doctor. Toshiaki waved him away. Kiyomi was going to die. He felt deceived. Everything seemed to be happening in some distant world. His entire body was still flushed. What was that, anyway? He wondered amidst the banging in his head. What on earth was that? Chapter 3. At 6 p.m., the three of them were allowed into the ICU. When they entered the room, they were instructed to change into pale green sterilized gowns and hats, and to wear special masks. In addition, they had to sanitize their hands and feet. As for Toshiaki, he was already familiar with this type of procedure, having performed many experiments on animals in which prevention of infection, and therefore the wearing of such garments, came with the territory. But he never imagined he would be wearing them in a hospital setting. Because Kiyomi's father was a surgeon by profession, he became a respectable figure in this attire. Only Kiyomi's mother, visibly annoyed by the sensation of the rough-hewn gown against her skin, was unaccustomed to it. It was an unexpectedly large room. There were a number of stretchers lined against the wall, and half as many machines used for blood transfusions. 2 small monitors were installed in the wall, from which countless tubes and wires extended. In spite of all the technology, most of the other beds were unoccupied, giving the room a dormant atmosphere. Kiyomi was laying down on the second nearest bed. Tubes had been inserted into her nostrils. Toshiaki followed them with his eyes. They ran from her nose into a bucket-shaped object and continued from there into a white machine that had several manual controls and a meter with a needle, which quivered left and right within its prescribed arc. It wasn't a large machine, but every time the needle jumped, a hissing sound issued. This was the respirator, according to the doctor. The wall monitors were both aglow with Kiyomi's brainwave activity. They all gathered around and gazed upon her. Her head was shaven and wrapped in cloth and bandages, but the rest of her was covered with a simple sheet, and no other injuries could be spotted. Aside from the scars on her head, she looked completely unscathed. After leaving the room, the doctor led the way to his office. He offered them a seat and sat down at his desk. Films of Kiyomi's CT scans had been posted to a light box on the wall. As he showed them the brainwave data, the doctor began to explain more about her condition. Brain death, he said, was an irreversible state that occurred when the brain stem was deprived of blood and ceased to function. This was distinct from a, quote, vegetative state, where the brain stem was still functional. The hospital was required to verify any potential patient's condition with an officially sanctioned examination in accordance with welfare ministry standards. Additional brain wave response inspections, along with more CT scans, were also available at their hospital. These are the results of the first exam, conducted at 5 o'clock. The doctor handed them a spreadsheet, which contained the results of Kiyomi's auditory brain stem response, pulmonary dilation, and respiratory tests. The doctor explained each in detail. He emphasized that there were no noticeable changes in her brainwave activity in the face of stimuli, and that she was not breathing on her own. If she were taken off her respirator, she would cease to breathe. Her heart would fail, and her temperature would plummet. On the right side of the form was a blank chart in which the second examination's results, to be conducted the following afternoon, were to be recorded. We will see if the second test yields the same results. By that time, over 6 hours will have passed since the first, and this is how we ensure no mistake is being made. Toshiaki was only half listening to the doctor's words. He could not dispel Kiyomi's peaceful expressions from his mind. We will leave her as she is for now on the respirator. I would recommend that you discuss, as a family, the issue of when to take her off it. Until then, you have my word that we will do anything in our power to sustain her. We will keep her on a nutrient-rich IV and periodically shift her lying position so she won't develop bed sores. Please understand, though, that while she may be breathing, Kiyomi-san is already, in fact, dead. They all returned later that evening to the ICU and sat at Kiyomi's bedside. Her father had begun to regain some emotional stability by now, while her mother was still unable to make sense of things, overwhelmed as she was by her tears. The day's hardships had etched weary circles under her eyes. She laid herself down, completely exhausted. Kiyomi's father, realizing the day had been too much on his wife, thought it better to return home and left with her in his arms. Toshiaki was unable to sleep and stayed behind. At around 10 that evening, a nurse came in to give Kiyomi's body a rub down with a hot towel. The petite nurse exuded nothing but sweetness. Still in her early 20s, she possessed a genuine sincerity, and the special attention she afforded to Kiyomi struck a chord in Toshiaki's heart. As he helped the nurse with her work, Toshiaki again felt the warmth of Kiyomi's skin. A few beads of perspiration dotted her back, and saliva had welled up in her mouth. Her skin was still firm, cheeks flushed with a pale rouge. Toshiaki had never seen a so-called, quote, vegetable, but as he looked upon Kiyomi's body, it was impossible for him to distinguish her from that harsh term. Please, talk to your wife, the nurse said with a smile as she went about emptying Kiyomi's bedpan. It'll cheer her up. Toshiaki did not doubt the nurse's advice, and so he held Kiyomi's hand, talking to her continually throughout the night. He told her about his day, shared memories, and talked about the things he loved the most about her. He felt a warmth from her palm passing into him. Her chest rose and fell regularly at the hiss of the respirator echoed throughout the ICU. Toshiaki went to the university early the next morning, overcome by a sudden desire to be alone. He drove slowly through the streets, which now seemed to him devoid of shadow and form. A faint mist hovered around the campus grounds. As Toshiaki inhaled damp air into his lungs, he walked into the building and went straight to his lab. It was still early, so there was no one else around. He sat down at his desk, leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep breath. Outside the window, the pale houses along the road blurred far into the distant haze. The image of Kiyomi's comatose face wavered in his mind. Toshiaki had witnessed the death of loved ones more than he would have liked, whether from terminal illness or simply old age. He could honestly say he was capable of understanding death. That is, until he saw his wife's body laying completely motionless on a hospital stretcher. Any previously held notions of mortality no longer applied. But was she really dead? In Toshiaki's delusional state, pessimism encountered the warmth lingering in his hands from the night before in subtle billows of conflict. His knowledge of the controversy surrounding brain death had been gleaned from television, newspapers, and further from various educational materials and medical journals. If anything, Toshiaki's attitude was affirmative. Brain death was to him a scientific matter that was unfairly subjected to sentimental arguments. When there were patients who needed organ transplants in order to survive, why, he wondered, should people hesitate to have replacements extracted from brain-dead donors? He gnawed at his lip at the thought of taking organs from Kiyomi's living body. Toshiaki conducted dissections on rats and mice nearly every day. Yet he was far from accustomed to it. It always made him terribly uncomfortable to imagine doing likewise to a human being. In his mind, the image of an anesthetized lab rat with its stomach cut open overlapped that of Kiyomi's nude figure, the rat's liver and kidneys distorting into her abdomen. Kidneys. Toshiaki shut his eyes. Kiyomi had registered as a kidney donor last year. It all came back to him quite clearly now. Toshiaki thought organ transplantations were something to be lauded. It would be wonderful, of course, if Kiyomi's kidneys could be of any use. Yet, because she was still warm with life, and her heart going strong, he could not let himself be reconciled to the idea of extracting her kidneys. He simply did not feel that his wife was dead. He was confident that she could go on and live. He opened his eyes. The mist had already dispelled outside, and the buildings along the streets now greeted the dawn, scintillating blindly in the morning sun. A crow's cry could be heard in the distance. A new day was beginning. For most, it would be like any other. For Toshiaki, it would become the day in which the reality of his wife's accident would leave behind its first indelible traces. He needed to move around, but before returning to the hospital, he walked over to the cultivation room to check his cell cultures once more. He would replace them with a new batch if they had stabilized. He inspected his flasks under the microscope. There was nothing particularly in need of attention. He gazed vacantly at his hybridoma and cancer cell cultures. Then, without warning, an idea came to him. Toshiaki took his eyes from the lenses and peered at the red indicator solution inside the flask. A voice filled with wonder escaped from his lips. "Oh, Kiyomi!" His heart was racing. He sprung from his chair. The idea spread swiftly through his mind. As he staggered away, he could not take his eyes from the flasks upon the table. Kiyomi's body undoubtedly suffered extreme brain trauma. Still, when he held her hand, he knew life continued to emanate from her. Not everything in her had died. His eyes still glued to the flasks, Toshiaki clenched his fists and shouted at the ceiling. In his excitement, the hospital was much too far away. He slammed on the gas pedal and changed gears hastily, muttering Kiyomi's name under his breath. There was so much to do. He had to see what Kiyomi's parents thought about offering up her kidneys, re-establish his connections with an old surgeon friend, and ultimately gain the doctor's approval for his plan. He was sure of achieving this all without a hitch. Kiyomi was still alive. Knowing this for sure, tears began to flow from his eyes. "From now on, my dear, we'll always be together." So did his heart cry out. Chapter 4. Toshiaki and his father-in-law watched intently as the second examination was carried out. The doctor in charge, whom they had met only yesterday, divided his duties with another. Toshiaki had prepared himself for some grandiose procedure, but in actuality all they did was place headphones on her and poke her skin to see whether or not she responded to stimuli. Kiyomi's brain waves remained even. The head doctor recorded the results on the chart. Toshiaki mused about how unscientific their methods were. All findings were negative. When he was done, the doctor handed over the form and gave a look that seemed to implore acknowledgement. Toshiaki compared the chart to Kiyomi's face, then returned it to the doctor with a single nod. The doctor accepted the form, signed his name on the top, and stamped it. "Kiyomi-san has been judged to be brain dead." "Yes." Toshiaki knew he could have said something more appropriate and was amazed by his own vapid response. "Well then, please step into my office for a moment," the doctor said, and led them in. A woman was waiting inside. Upon noticing them, she stood up from her chair and bowed politely. Toshiaki returned the gesture vaguely. "This is our transplant coordinator, Asusa Odagiri," stated the doctor by way of introduction. "It has been brought to my attention that Kiyomi-san is a registered kidney donor, so I took the liberty of inviting her here." Odagiri handed them her business card. The suit-clad woman looked younger than Toshiaki and gave the impression of a capable professional. Her piercing eyes contrasted with the gentle curve of her cheek lines, and this imbalance helped give her an air of being approachable. Her expression promised honesty and intelligence. She bowed slightly again and said how pleased she was to meet them. A recipient's transplant procedure could only be consummated when a donor was present. The only available donors, excluding those still living and depending on the type of treatment needed, were usually patients diagnosed with brain death or heart failure. ER doctors needed to stay focused on their own tasks, so it was undesirable for them to push to perform these operations. On the other hand, If a transplant surgeon approached the patient's family directly for the organs, it invariably ended in hurt feelings. To mediate between transplant and emergency medicine, someone had to deal specifically with all these issues. This was where the transplant coordinator, Odagiri, came in. Hers was a job which spanned many areas, and because of the doctor's overbearing schedules, meticulous familial consolation and care was upheld as the most important part of her duties. Toshiaki and his in-laws seated themselves on the couch and faced her. I will get right to the point here. With Kiyomi's kidneys, we could save the lives of 2 dialysis patients. CRF, or chronic renal failure, is a condition that can afflict even the very young. Unfortunately, there is no cure. All they can do is clean out the body through dialysis treatment. But because the time factor is involved, it's nearly impossible for such patients to lead an active social life, and they are under strict dietary restrictions as well. With a transplant of just 1 kidney, a patient could begin to live normally. I assure you that these kidneys would be by no means wasted. Toshiaki listened to this earnest appeal and spoke up to discuss details. I understand perfectly well that Kiyomi's kidneys could save the lives of others, and I'd like to donate them for that purpose. It was her wish to register in the first place, and I think we should respect it. So please do what you feel is best in this situation. I only ask that you remove nothing more. I don't know if Kiyomi would have approved any further extractions. I would never dream of doing anything without her prior consideration. He felt they were conversing like actors in a play. After speaking his mind, he awaited the reaction of his father-in-law, who closed his eyes and managed to nod once in approval. I am truly grateful for your willingness to go along with this. I cannot thank you enough. Odagiri bowed her head deeply in gratitude. I will help you through the entire process to the best of my ability. Toshiaki carefully filled in the transplant consent form that Odagiri presented. In the center of this thin sheet was written, I hereby consent to the surgical removal of the following organs and tissues from the body of the patient for the purpose of transplantation. This dry sentence had been printed in the middle of the form. In the blank spaces above it, Toshiaki entered in his wife's name, address, date of birth, and sex. Then, gathering all of his strength, he circled the word kidneys. At that point, he inhaled deeply, and before exhaling, entered the current date, his surname as the consenting party, address, and relation to the donor. I'll also need your seal here. Odagiri pointed to a spot at the bottom with a long white finger. Toshiaki took out his personal seal from his pocket. With great tact, Odagiri removed a red ink pad from her purse and placed it in front of him. Toshiaki pushed down hard on the seal with a slight wriggling motion, affixing it to the form. His name stamp, Nagashima, stood out vividly, almost to the point of lewdness. He averted his eyes for a moment and wondered if he was making the best choice. He had just officially sanctioned the removal of organs from the woman he loved more than anyone. Such a serious decision was made by merely signing a single sheet of paper. But this was the right thing to do. Toshiaki shook his head. It was late in the game to be having such qualms. Hadn't he decided that this would extend her life? Didn't this have to be done, so that he could be with her always? Kiyomi was not only what was on the outside, but rather every living cell in her body was Kiyomi, and he had to make her his. Toshiaki needed to make his move. Just then, a sort of fever seized him. It was the same heat that had visited him when the doctor had told him about Kiyomi's condition. His head began to spin. As they were leaving the office, Toshiaki edged stealthily past his father-in-law's over to the doctor and spoke in a hushed voice. "I actually have a request concerning Kiyomi." "Yes?" "Please, just hear me out. This has to be confidential between us. I want something in exchange for offering her kidneys." "Exchange? What?" The doctor eyed him suspiciously. Toshiaki placed his trembling arm around the doctor's back as if restraining him and whispered, "Give me Kiyomi's liver. I want to use it for a primary culture." Chapter 5. Upon finishing his ward duties, Kunio Shinohara returned to the Department of Surgery on the 5th floor of the Clinical Research Center. He rode the elevator down, proceeded to the right, and opened the office door. As he massaged his shoulder, he crossed the lifeless room over to his desk. When he passed the experimentation table, he cast a glance at the digital clock resting upon it. It indicated 5:30. On his desk were 2 memos left by his secretary. They concerned his request for a copy of a medical article — alas, it could not be found — and a visit from a pharmaceutical company's marketing representative. Shinohara took a small notepad from the chest pocket of his white coat and tossed it onto the desk. He massaged his shoulder again, trying to loosen the stiffness that had knotted itself there during the course of the day. These actions had become frequent and involuntary for him. He mumbled out loud that the distance from the ward to his office was just impossible. Hearing himself, he looked around the room embarrassedly. It was rare for no one else to be there. Usually, at least one of his younger research students was around. Maybe they had gone out to eat a little earlier than usual. He poured some instant coffee into a mug and sat down at his desk before opening his address book to scribble in some additional plans. As he was doing so, the telephone rang. It wasn't an internal call. The low electronic tremolo indicated an outside caller. Shinohara stood up and walked over to the phone, cup in hand. He then took a sip of his coffee, picked up the receiver, and answered. "Hello, surgery department." "This is Nagashima from the School of Pharmaceutical—" "What? Is that you, Nagashima?" A smile came to Shinohara's face as he nodded to the voice on the other end. Shinohara's relationship with Toshiaki began when he took the same pharmaceutical seminar to complete his PhD. Simply passing the state exams didn't mean a medical school graduate could get a PhD. He had to remain at the dispensary for a standard period, writing articles and passing tests. In those days, the 29-year-old Shinohara placed the utmost priority in getting his PhD. Drowning under the extra work requested of him by his seniors, he managed to continue cultivating cells. Shinohara's dissertation topic was cancer gene production in liver cells. To study this, he collected cells from extracted rat livers, carried out primary cultures, then took healthy liver cells and added cancer-inducing drugs to observe the formation of proteins. The focus was almost banal, but back then the particular protein byproduct had yet to be researched extensively and was good for a doctoral thesis. The associate professor of Toshiaki's seminar had developed a detector for this protein. Toshiaki himself was still a graduate student then. Cancer cells had not been his area, but he carried out daily primary cultures on rat liver cells, excelling him greatly in the skills involved. Shinohara learned these techniques well from him, staying on for 2 years as a research student before returning to the medical department to obtain his doctorate a year later. He continued his friendship with Toshiaki, with whom he occasionally went out drinking. Despite being separated a little by age, they enjoyed each other's company as equals. As Shinohara pressed the receiver to his ear, he downed a mouthful of coffee. "Boy, not tonight," he thought, amusedly at first. Yet right away he realized that something was not quite right. A voice was groaning across the wires. Shinohara furrowed his brow, wondering if some lines had come crossed, and tried pushing down the cradle a few times. Something was wrong. Toshiaki hadn't spoken a word since announcing himself. White steam rose from Shinohara's coffee cup, engraving helical spirals into the air. Unable to endure the silence any longer, Shinohara opened his mouth to say something when a low voice came from the receiver's depths. "Kiyomi is dead." Shinohara shivered. He looked unconsciously around the empty room. The fluorescent light flickered, then regained radiance, casting its usual shadows on the floor, each particle of light feeling like rain. The fluorescent light flickered, then regained radiance, casting its usual shadows on the floor, each particle of light falling like rain. "What?" Shinohara surprised himself with the volume of his voice. 2 minute globules of his saliva traced arcs in the air before descending out of sight. "But Kiyomi lives." "Hey, back up! Extract Kiyomi's liver cells for me. I'm not a doctor, so I'd never be able to handle it, but I can count on you, right?" "Kiyomi, what happened to her?" "I'm coming there right now. You'll do this for me?" "What are you talking about? Where are you right now?" "I'll be there soon." And with that, the line went dead. Shinohara stood in place for a while, grasping the receiver tightly. Frozen in bewilderment, he was unable to make heads or tails of this. The only thing he could say for sure was that his old pal was not himself. He thought of Toshiaki's last statement, "I'll be there soon," and frantically looked about the room. Did he mean to his office? He had called from an outside line. Where was Toshiaki now? Just then, not even 1 minute after the call, the door opened behind him. Startled, Shinohara looked over his shoulder. Toshiaki was standing there, a faint smile upon his face. The cup slipped from Shinohara's hand and shattered into pieces. Chapter 6. Mariko Anzai was in her room, poring over the math homework spread out across her desk. She was singing along to a tape of her favorite pop singer that a friend from school had made for her. Her assignment was surprisingly difficult for a change, but since this was her favorite subject, she was up to the challenge. Just when she had figured out the problem she was working on, the phone rang. All right, she muttered, receiving the interruption with mild irritation. She stood up and went out into the hallway. The clock showed 8:20. Outside her room, the house felt all too cold and silent. Her father had yet to return home from work, but these days it was not unusual for him to be out until 11. Since becoming the head of his department, it was always like that. He was quick to attribute his lateness to his busy schedule, but Mariko knew the real reason. You just don't want to look at me more than you have to. The phone's ringing threaded into the patter of her slippers on the hallway floor. These seemed to be the only two sounds in the house. She picked up the receiver unceremoniously. Hello? Good evening. My name is Odagiri. I am a transplant coordinator. I must apologize for the unexpected call, but is Shigenori Anzai at home? Mariko held her breath and looked reflexively at her left wrist. The sleeve of her sweatshirt was rolled up, exposing the IV hole in which her eyes were drawn. Further up along her arm was another hole concealed beneath the sleeve, and both began to tingle. Dad hasn't come back from work yet, she replied unsteadily with an uncomfortable smile. Is this Mariko by any chance? Yeah, this is Mariko. Ah, good. Actually, I'm calling because of a donor for your kidney transplant has been found, and I wanted to pass along the good news. Her heart skipped a beat. A kidney transplant. The words ran along her spine and poked her skin with goose flesh. When Mariko's first kidney transplant failed, her father was insistent about registering on a waiting list for kidneys from non-living donors. Only a year and a half passed since then. She was amazed that an organ had surfaced so soon. Mariko retraced her memories of the past 18 months. Suitable non-living donors are rare, which means we'll just have to be patient and wait. This is what a doctor named Yoshizumi had told her with a pat on her head. But to Mariko, still in elementary school at the time, these words were meaningless. She never planned on going through a second transplant. She'd only heeded her father's requests to save his face. When her father heard Yoshizumi's words, he asked the doctor uneasily, "Wait for how long?" I can't really say for sure. At the larger metropolitan area hospitals, over 10 transplants from cadavers are performed every year, but that's because Tokyo itself produces relatively ample supply of donors. Hereabouts, we carry about only a procedure or two a year. There are all those who are brain dead, but the idea of extracting organs from them doesn't sit well with most of society, at least here in Japan. So all we can do is wait for a kidney from a heart failure patient. We need the freshest organ possible, but the way things are now, many obstacles stand in our way that significantly narrow down the number of available kidneys. Compatibility is also a concern. There is a waiting list, but it has an order that must be strictly adhered to out of fairness to all potential recipients. If a suitable kidney is found in another's region, it's possible to have it shipped here. Even so, it's not uncommon for patients to wait 5, even 10 years. 10 years! Mariko could still remember clearly her father's hopeless expression at that moment. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do it right this time? Yoshizumi said with a hint of bitterness. Mariko simply looked downward, biting her lip. She was sure they blamed her. They thought the operation had failed because she wouldn't listen. They all acted nice towards her, but actually hated her so much they wanted to hit her. What did they know anyway? Have you gotten sick at all recently? A cold, maybe? Said the woman on the phone, yanking Mariko from her unpleasant reverie. Mariko curtly replied that she had not come down with anything. She pressed her left hand to her chest, trying as much as she could to calm the heartbeat rising inside of her. Am I really going to have another transplant? This time, it would not be her father's kidney as before, but one from a complete stranger's lifeless body. The idea sank into her guts like a stone into water. Images of the fish she dissected in a science class experiment and a cat run over in the same street came to her mind. The organ of a dead human being, a corpse's kidney, was going to be placed into her body. A dreadfully cold sensation ran through her. No way! I don't want a transplant! Unaware of Mariko's pain thoughts, Odagiri continued in her fast-talking manner. Do you know what time your father will return from work? He's always late, so... When he gets home, please tell him to call me as soon as possible, okay? If you can, call him right now. Ask him whether or not you want to proceed with the operation. If we don't hear back from you soon enough, we'll be forced to go down the waiting list, so please, the sooner the better. By the time Shigenori Anzai returned home, it was past 11. His section was preparing for the release of next year's word processor models. He had been incredibly busy these past few weeks, unable to even enjoy his days off. Work had become exactly the bad habit he'd always imagined it would. He'd opened the front door in a weary daze and noticed the hall light was off. Thinking it curious, he flipped it on and looked down. Mariko's shoes were on the floor, so he knew she was home. Ordinarily, she would have left the light on for him. After loosening his necktie, Anzai went into the kitchen and grabbed some cold-cut ham and a can of beer from the refrigerator. Taking the ham between his teeth, he opened the door to the living room, sat on the floor, and clicked on the television. An airplane crash in South America was being discussed on the late-night news. As he watched images of the accident, he thought about how seldom he saw his daughter these days. She was probably still awake, but then he no longer did such things like go to her room and say hi. They were both busy in the mornings, too, and hardly exchanged a word. They ate their meals separately, something that had already become the normal for them. Things would probably stay this way until Mariko went off to college. Anzai guzzled down his beer. The news ended about 20 minutes later. He needed to take a look at some files, so he switched off the television and stretched. Dad, Mariko suddenly called from behind him. Anzai turned around quickly to see her standing there in her pajamas. Her eyes looked a bit swollen. What is it? Something wrong? Mariko was silent for a while. Her cryptic attitude irritated him a little. You had dinner, right? He said. Still hungry? You shouldn't keep eating late, you know. A while ago, there was a call. Picking up on her tenseness, Anzai put his beer on the table and stood up. A phone call? From the hospital, you mean? Was it the doctor? No. It was the transplant something. Transplant. Anzai stiffened. What did they want? Did you listen to what they had to say? When did they call? Around 8:30? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Anzai clicked his tongue at her, then ran to the phone. He got the number from her and dialed it. Had their turn come? There was no other explanation, so why, he wondered, had Mariko been so hesitant to tell him? Soon a voice came from the other end. Should we plan on proceeding with the transplant? Of course, by all means, Anzai said excitedly. The coordinator began by briefly laying out the most immediate concerns. She wanted Mariko to come to the hospital as soon as possible. If the results of her examinations checked out, all they would have to do was wait for the donor's heart to stop. With immeasurable gratitude in his voice, Anzai thanked her and hung up. Mariko, you're getting a transplant! I never thought they'd find one this soon. You'll be able to eat tasty meals again. He looked at Mariko with a smile, but she was trembling with a pale face that was far from rejoicing. She shook her head from side to side. Anzai swallowed back his joy and extended a hand towards her. What is it, Mariko? They're going to fix everything. Aren't you happy? No, she said wearily. Why was she being so disagreeable? What's with you tonight? Everything's going to be fine now. You were so happy the first time, weren't you? Mariko shook off her father's hand. No, I don't want a transplant. Anzai approached her, but she only turned away, tears in her eyes. She began heaving up sobs. The sudden good news must have confused her. He had no idea how to calm her. Mariko. With knees shaking, she stepped back to the wall and screamed, I'm not Frankenstein's monster! I don't want to become a monster! Chapter 7. Dr. Takashi Yoshizumi was contacted by Odagiri at 11:30 p.m. with news of a donor from the university hospital. Yoshizumi, who had just been looking over all the patient's data spread out over his desk, sat upright at the word donor. She's a 25-year-old woman, brain dead from an intracerebral hemorrhage. I met with her family this afternoon, and we have their consent. Nodding to the coordinator's every point, Yoshizumi jotted down a more abbreviated form of what she had just said into a memo pad. Asuza Odagiri had assumed her position as coordinator just last year, yet she was already well known for her meticulousness and her skill with donor families. In recent cases Yoshizumi had owed much to Odagiri for her sound dealings, which enabled successful operations. Yoshizumi worked at the City Central Hospital, the main institution for kidney transplants in the region. When the families of brain-dead patients offered for the deceased's organs to be donated, an attending physician made a call to the CCH. The transplant coordinator then met with the family personally to explain the details of the transplant process. If they accepted her proposal, she obtained their signatures on consent forms. The procedure was, in effect, no different for patients who had registered at organ banks, because no transplantation could really be performed against a bereaved family's wishes. We have a candidate recipient. I'll wire the data over to you. Yoshizumi nodded in approval and pushed the startup button on his PC. Now that the information was being transferred, preparations were already half finished. At the CCH, recipients were usually chosen after the following steps. First, a sample of the donor's blood was extracted and sent to the lab to check its ABO and HLA types. A routine test was also made for diseases like AIDS. With this data in hand, the coordinator began the selection process. At the CCH, designated the Regional Center for Kidney Transplants, there were data on file from many patients hoping for an organ. These included name, date of birth, nature of compatibility, as well as histories of blood transfusions, transplants, and dialysis. In the region alone, approximately 600 people were on the waiting list for kidneys of the dead. The first to be chosen were those whose blood types most closely matched with the available donor. Then, from within that group, candidates were ranked by HLA compatibility. Since there were no 2 kidneys for every donor, 2 different recipients were usually chosen. It was customary for one of them to come from Yoshizumi's hospital, partly because it handled coordination duties. His hospital's 2 most highly compatible patients were summoned for tests, and the more suitable one ultimately underwent the operation. If it looked like there were no viable candidates in the local region at all, they would search via the national hub of kidney transplants, Sakura National Hospital in Chiba, to ship kidneys to some other part of the country. When the transportation of organ could not be executed swiftly, however, chances were that the kidney would not take. The organ lost its freshness, and it weakened if it took too long to ship. It wasn't without reason that recipients were selected first by region. Yoshizumi cradled the receiver on his shoulder and began typing. The coordinator's data appeared on screen. A list of prospective recipients ranked from highest to lowest by compatibility. He scrolled down, briefly surveying the entire list. Number 1, Mariko Anzai, and number 2, Matsuzo Iwata, are the prospective candidates. Miss Anzai will be under your care. Yoshizumi had heard that name somewhere before. He wrinkled his forehead, then gasped in surprise. After taking a moment to collect himself, he scrolled up and peered closely at number 1. Mariko Anzai. Yes, he knew that name. She was 14 years old and had already had 1 transplant at the CCH Transplantation Division. Yoshizumi looked at Mariko's HLA type. It was consistent with the donors. 0 mismatches. Mariko Anzai. There was no mistaking it now. It was the same girl Yoshizumi had operated on 2 years before. She had received her father's kidney, but the transplant had failed. The operation itself was a success, and no serious rejection symptoms had appeared. Yet the kidney did not assimilate with her body and finally had to be extracted. Yoshizumi bit his lower lip. He had much to regret about the case. HLA, or human leukocyte antigen, is a genetic marker found on the surface of human cells. The HLA of pathogenic cells differ from one's own. When illness attacks, unrecognized HLA types are regarded as intruders and subsequently destroyed as a natural immune system response. Because HLA is also found on the surface of transplanted organ cells, the organ is incompatible whenever its antigen type differs from the recipient's. For this reason, transplants between people of similar HLA types are preferred. Only, unlike the simple ABO blood types, HLA types are quite complex. There are 6 classes of HLA: A, B, C, DR, DQ, and DP. Each encompasses 10 or more subclasses. In transplant medicine, the most advanced analysis compares A, B, and DR types. Each of these 3 antigen classes is inherited, one from each patient. In other words, 3 classes and 6 pairs of antigens can be analyzed. The abundance of antigen classes, however, was a troublesome factor. Finding a donor with 6-fold match was not easy. Even between siblings, the chances of full compatibility were only 1 in 4, and the probability of a perfect compatibility with someone outside the family was less than 1 in 10,000. Because of this, many transplants were performed despite 1 or even 2 mismatches. This, however, meant that the organ had a higher chance of being rejected. In Anzai's case, the transplant had taken place between father and daughter, and tissue compatibility was high. It should have been a successful transplant, yet it failed, and the reason was that Yoshizumi and his team had failed to gain the trust of Mariko Anzai. Yoshizumi breathed in deeply. He gazed upon Mariko's name at the top of the display and pressed his fingertips around his temples to interrupt the unpleasant memories bubbling up in his head. He told himself to concentrate on the work at hand and spoke to Odagiri, who was waiting patiently. "So, Mariko Anzai has no mismatches?" "Correct," she replied. "There are no other donors in this area with such perfect compatibility. Please take some time to review the data." It was true. None with just 1 mismatch either. There were, however, 5 candidates with 2 mismatches. One of them, the 3rd name on the list, had been selected as the other candidate for this donor's kidneys. He was 51 years old, had a 5-year dialysis history, and was currently under care in a neighboring prefecture. A woman who was number 2 on this list couldn't be reached. An estimated 20,000 people in all of Japan were registered for kidney transplants. Yet, within that group, the annual number who actually received organs hovered at around 200. Then there were the dialysis patients, who numbered 120,000 nationwide. The consideration awarded to transplants for patients with chronic renal failure was too small. Compared to Europe and America, Japan was known for having extremely high dialysis patient-to-transplant operation ratio. By no means did this indicate that Japan's medical techniques were behind the times. Instead, it was public unease about regarding brain death as actual death that was the primary source of hesitation for doctors and patients alike to promote such procedures. Praying for a new kidney, patients were forced to deal with a long life of dialysis, a process both physically and financially straining, while those fortunate enough to receive a kidney were able to enjoy a normal social life. One more thing. Just in case candidate number 1 can't accept the kidney, it has been decided that number 5 will also come to the hospital for testing," said Odagiri. "She is 36 years old, with 2 mismatches, and a 3.5-year dialysis history." Got it. He printed out the charts for the 2 main candidates. In the instance that Mariko had contracted some serious illness, the 36-year-old woman would take her place on the selection ladder. Yoshizumi compared schedules with the coordinator and solidified their arrangements. He was to perform the extraction first at the university hospital. He would then pass one of the kidneys along to Odagiri, who would help them ship it to the neighboring prefecture, while Yoshizumi brought the other to the CCH to conduct an immediate transplant. Odagiri planned everything in great detail. Time between the extraction and the transplant was critical. Once the donor's heart stopped, they would be running on a tight schedule. It was the coordinator's responsibility to make sure all the surgeons, assistants, nurses, and recipients were on the same page. When all preliminaries had been exhausted, Yoshizumi thanked her and hung up. It seemed that Yoshizumi's chance at self-redemption had come at last. "Mariko Anzai, I'll save the kid if it's the last thing I do." Chapter 8. Just 2 days after the consent forms were signed, Kiyomi's heart rate began its inevitable decline. Her breathing maintained a certain regularity, if only through the respirator. However, her body's faculties were finally reaching their limits. Her vital signs were failing. "We've arranged for the transplantation unit from the City Central Hospital to come over here this evening," the doctor said to Toshiaki. "Once Kiyomi's heart stops, we'll need to extract her kidneys promptly. We need to prepare her femoral artery beforehand. For this purpose, we'll be conducting a simple operation tonight. After her heart stops, a cannula will be inserted into the artery to cool her kidneys." The securing of the arteries was soon completed. When Toshiaki returned to the ICU, he saw that Kiyomi's thigh was marked for insertion of the cannula. Her medication had been stopped, but her blood pressure remained steady, wavering around 100. The doctor explained they would likely need to wait until morning, and Kiyomi's warmth will only last just as long, thought Toshiaki absently. Moment by moment, her body was changing into a mere object for donation. Unable to shake the reality of it from his mind, Toshiaki spent the night at his wife's bedside. At 10 p.m., the nurse came in, as usual. She emptied Kiyomi's bedpan, swabbed her nostrils and the inside of her mouth, wiped the perspiration from her back with a towel, and changed her body position to prevent bed sores. She did all of this without the faintest sign of annoyance. In fact, she sometimes cast a sympathetic smile at Toshiaki as she worked. Toshiaki had never been seriously ill. He had, of course, spoken with many medical practitioners throughout his career, but realized that they knew nothing, until now, of the actual work that the doctors and nurses did. "I'm truly grateful," Toshiaki said, bowing his head. "I think Kiyomi is too, for all you've done for her." The nurse stopped what she was doing and said, smiling, "I'm happy to hear that. I'm sorry we weren't able to help her." "It's okay," he countered, flushed. "You did everything you could, all of you." The nurse's smile turned ambiguous. She looked away from him as she resumed her duties. "Working in the ICU, sometimes I just don't know," she said timidly, almost to herself. You can give your all to the patients. They still die almost every day. What are we doing here? It's just too depressing sometimes. ICU nurses quit much faster than in other departments. Still. Her words cut off there as she finished with the cleaning. She put Kiyomi's clothing back on and turned to face Toshiaki, hands at her sides. When people say nice things to you, it makes you want to go on. With that, she exited the ICU. Chapter 9. Kiyomi remained in quiet stasis until morning. Soon after the minute hand ticked past noon, her blood pressure began to drop rapidly. By 1 p.m., it had fallen below 95, and an hour later was below 80. The ICU soon became a swarm of doctors and nurses as they bustled in and out, driving Toshiaki and his father-in-law into the corner of the room. It was such a marked contrast to the quiet that followed the brain death examination. The CCH transplant team will be arriving at 2:30, said one of the doctors, looking at his wristwatch. They'll start by inserting a catheter. The extraction will begin once she loses her pulse. May we be present when she passes on? The doctor nodded. You'll have 5 minutes to say your farewells, after which Kiyomi will be brought to the operating room. The hissing of the respirator was inaudible in all the commotion. Kiyomi's blood pressure was now down to 75. Yoshizumi, accompanied by Odagiri and 2 staff members, entered the university hospital. They brought with them a minimal but essential array of surgical equipment and perfusion containers for Kiyomi's kidneys. This being a university hospital, there was plenty of technology at their disposal, but Yoshizumi never forgot to have his own by his side for an extraction. Because speed was so imperative, it only made sense to use his own familiar tools. After exchanging greetings with the hospital staff, Yoshizumi left Odagiri in the waiting room and went into the ICU to check on the donor. Her blood pressure was nearing 65 and her heart rate down to 30 beats per minute. Once her blood pressure fell below 50, circulation would no longer be complete, and the cells in her extremities would begin to decay. Since the donor's family had consented to the procedure, the catheter was going to be inserted into her femoral artery now, so that they would be ready when the pressure fell below 50. The head doctor showed the donor's data to Yoshizumi for confirmation. Odagiri was then informed via intercom that the catheter was being inserted. 15 minutes later, Yoshizumi and his assistants prepared the perfusion equipment. They spread the donor's legs slightly and placed the machinery between her feet. One of the assistants soon began to adjust the equipment settings, while another disinfected the area around her thighs, whereupon a silicone double balloon tip catheter was readied. When sterilization was complete, Yoshizumi looked at the donor, staring at her left side. When sterilization was complete, Yoshizumi looked at the donor standing at her left side and patiently confirmed that the femoral artery and vein were well secured. After a quick glance to see that his team was on full standby, he inserted the balloon tip catheter into the donor. He carefully advanced the catheter until the balloon arrived at the right spot. Yoshizumi indicated his approval to the assistants with a single nod and told them exactly what to do. They connected a perfusion pump to the end of the catheter. He then guided the catheter into the femoral vein and had it connected as well. All preparatory steps were now complete. Her blood pressure was 62 and her heart rate had fallen further. Yoshizumi and his crew temporarily exited the ICU to wait it out. Noticing the family, he signaled for them to be let in and head to the doctor's office. He hadn't met the family yet, and it was indeed his belief that he should keep a low profile with them. For the bereaved, a transplant surgeon was no better than a hyena snatching away the body of a relative. He did plan to meet with them just once before the actual operation, but it was the coordinator's task to intermediate between them. No need to risk upsetting the family. Yoshizumi sipped some coffee in the office, reclined on the couch, and looked up at the ceiling. Mariko Anzai's face came to him. She sensed the change. Kiyomi Nagashima's body was crossing over to death. After the accident, her metamorphosis had proceeded slowly but surely. Now it was accelerating. Kiyomi was dying. Her body was losing warmth, and it would stiffen at first and eventually dissolve. Her brain had already begun its deterioration. Hormonal discharges would soon stop. Blood flow was weakening. Cells were rupturing and crudely spewing their contents. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Robbing Kiyomi of her vision was the easy part. A little trick on her optical nerves was all it took. In that small window of opportunity, she induced Kiyomi's hands to turn the wheel off course. Her primary concern was ensuring that the accident didn't damage Kiyomi's body too much. It had to be brain death. If by minuscule chance she'd ruptured any internal organs by hitting her abdomen instead of her head, there would be no talk of kidney transplants. At the moment of collision, she gauged the most precise timing to apply the brakes. She held back Kiyomi's abdomen with all her strength to prevent it from lurching forward, fixing both of her hands on the steering wheel to protect against peripheral injury. Kiyomi's forehead struck the steering wheel. She could tell skull fragments had pierced the brain. Every time she thought of that moment, she felt a shiver of excitement. Kiyomi would die, but she would live forever. Kiyomi's kidneys were to be transplanted into 2 patients. Ideally, at least one of them would be female, and the process would be complete. Toshiaki would perform the primary culture as planned. She'd already induced such thoughts in him without him knowing. Toshiaki. She imagined his figure, and her body twisted slightly. It was almost time. Her entire being trembled. She remembered Toshiaki's voice, his expressions, the warmth of his body. She had been waiting for a man like him. He was the only human being who could appreciate and understand who she truly was. She refused to let go of such perfection. She would become one with him. An acrid excitement sent her into convulsions, and as Kiyomi's blood pressure made its rapid decline, she surrendered herself to the afterglow of her bliss. When Yoshizumi and staff received word that the blood pressure had dropped to 50, they returned to the ICU once again. An hour had lapsed since the catheter insertion. The assistant set up a number of Ringer's solution bottles to which Parista pumps were connected. After ensuring that the catheter was in position, Yoshizumi inflated its two balloons with clean air to intercept the blood flow. At Yoshizumi's signal, his assistant ran the pump. Cold perfusate passed through the catheter at a precisely calculated rate. Yoshizumi placed his hands on the side of the donor's chest to verify that it was flowing properly. The human body has a main abdominal artery and vein flowing through it, which a great amount of blood flows. The arteries which supply blood to the kidneys extend from this main artery. Similarly, the kidney veins are linked to the abdominal vein. The abdominal artery and vein each fork out in the lower abdominal region and continue into both legs. The balloon tip catheter had been inserted up through this lower arterial branch to reach the kidney extension, and the balloons then inflated to interrupt blood flow in the abdominal artery. At this point, a coolant, or perfusate, was sent through the catheter tube. There were minute holes in the tube between the balloons so that the perfusate could seep through into the abdominal artery. Since the artery was blocked above and below by the balloons, the perfusate flowed directly into the kidneys. The donor's kidneys were swiftly cooled and simultaneously flushed of blood. After the perfusate passed through, it traveled into the kidney veins and onto lower abdominal veins, where it was recovered by the perfusion device and sent back in. The fresher the kidney, the better. Compared to kidneys extracted from brain-dead donors, the heart failure donors' organs were inevitably less viable given the period of blood deprivation. To save the kidneys from such damage, it had become standard procedure to introduce a perfusate through the artery to rapidly cool the kidneys upon heart failure. Cooling them before they were extracted improved their chance of staying alive in their recipients. With the donor's family's consent, it was even possible to begin the procedure prior to heart failure. One of the assistants reported the perfusion rate at regular intervals, while another monitored the donor's heart rate. Her skin turned pale and cold from the lack of blood flow. It was 40 minutes since the perfusion began. Her heart stuttered, reducing her pulse to a hush. "Please call in the family," Yoshizumi said to the patient's doctor and nurse. "This will be their last chance to see her alive." At 20 minutes past 5, the nurse came into the waiting room to call Toshiaki and Kiyomi's parents. She informed them of the situation and brought them back to the ICU. When they walked into the room, Toshiaki was astonished at the dramatic change in Kiyomi. Unable to tear his eyes away, he gazed steadily at her face and approached her slowly with the doctor. With every step, her face grew more and more distinct. He looked around and stopped at the left side of the stretcher. His mother-in-law was sobbing behind him. Kiyomi's vital signs are indicated here, but as it is now, her pulse is erratic and nearly unverifiable, the doctor said as he pointed to the screen at Kiyomi's bedside. The respirator is still running, but she barely has any heartbeat, and her blood pressure has fallen sharply. Her skin, as you can see, is getting very cold. Kiyomi's face was so white it was nearly translucent, her lips like two flower petals glazed with frost. It looked like a clear stream was flowing inside her body. Lashes extended from closed eyelids like crystals, casting short, thin shadows upon her skin. Without thinking, Toshiaki extended a hand towards her cheek. The moment his fingertips made contact, a numb sensation shot through his arm to the back of his head, not unlike the time he'd accidentally touched dry ice, a pain that flickered between coldness and heat. He gasped, and his hand trembled. He stroked Kiyomi's cheek calmly with his index and middle fingers, continuing down along her neck, and then stopped at her white chest where the veins showed. Though obscured by her garment, he could tell clearly that Kiyomi's nipples were erect. Toshiaki took his hand away and wrapped his fingertips in his others to warm them. A cool sensation seemed to linger there. Toshiaki's heart leapt with a great thump that broke into its steady rhythm. Feeling as though he were suffocating, he placed his hand upon his chest. Thump! As if to mock his nerves' autonomy, his heart leapt again. He felt hot. "We will now stop the respirator if we may," the doctor said. Hands still clutching his chest, Toshiaki gazed at Kiyomi and took a deep breath, his lungs swelling unsteadily as they filled with air. Kiyomi's body is being destroyed, he thought. The doctor flipped the respirator switch. The machine, which until then had been keeping rhythm like a metronome, stopped in an unfinished hiss, and several seconds later let out a languid "tss." The movement in Kiyomi's chest abated. The doctor glanced at his wristwatch and said quietly, "Official time of death is 5:31 p.m. Kiyomi's father inhaled audibly. Thump! Toshiaki's heart cried out yet again. It was such an enormous wave of sound, he wondered why no one else in the room could hear it. Maybe Kiyomi was sending the last of her life energy to him, almost as if he had caught her final heartbeat. She seemed to be telling him, "I don't want to die." After the extraction, she will be transferred to the morgue for a post-mortem inspection, said the doctor before encouraging them to leave the room. Toshiaki and his in-laws exited the ICU. 3 men who looked to be doctors were standing in the hallway. The coordinator was behind them, holding a large box and giving instructions. One of the men, who looked to be the leader of the 3, noticed Toshiaki and Kiyomi's parents and approached them. He looked to be about 40 years of age, but a certain pride in his face made him appear younger. He bowed his head simply and stated his name. "I'm Takashi Yoshizumi from the transplantation staff at the City Central Hospital. I've been placed in charge of both the kidney extraction and transplant. We're about to begin the surgery. Please forgive me for being so brief." "I see. Good luck." Toshiaki extended his right hand and exchanged a handshake with this man called Yoshizumi, who was studying Toshiaki's face as if shocked at something. "What is it?" "Nothing. Excuse me." Yoshizumi bowed once again, and, seeming to shield his eyes, left together with the coordinator and the 2 other men into the prep room. After a while, Kiyomi's stretcher was wheeled back into the OR. "Please stay in the waiting room," a nurse called to them. Kiyomi's parents entered the narrow waiting room and collapsed onto the couch. Seeing this, Toshiaki went down the hallway to find the phone. "Kiyomi, just hold on a little longer," he murmured, recalling the image of her stark white cheek. Soon he would take her to a warm place where he could tend to her always. He would raise her. "Kiyomi, I will never part from you." Mariko was wheeled along on a stretcher. Shigenori Anzai followed along, holding the hand of his anesthetized daughter. "I'm sorry, sir, but you cannot pass beyond this point," informed one of the nurses, placing a hand on his arm as they reached the OR. The young doctor, pushing the stretcher, opened the door. Anzai was not allowed so much as to peek inside as Mariko's body was wheeled in. "Please leave everything to us," said the doctor before ducking out of sight. Anzai gazed at his palm where Mariko's hand had been only a moment before, and instinctively made a fist to keep her warmth there. "Mr. Anzai, calm yourself. Everything's going to be fine. Please rest over here," a nurse said, leading him into the waiting room. She sat down upon a couch, then brought him some coffee from a vending machine. She handed Anzai the hot paper cup, which he grasped with both hands. His thoughts were churning over the events of the night before. Soon after talking with the coordinator, he'd arranged for a taxi to take them to the hospital. Mariko threw such a tantrum the entire ride over, he'd feared she'd have an actual fit. When they arrived, she calmed herself somewhat, but cried for what seemed forever. She was never so emotional during the last transplant. Mariko was moved immediately to the ICU for testing. After verifying her dialysis data and checking her blood pressure and potassium count, she was subjected to dialysis and transfusions. She was screened thoroughly for infectious diseases. They seemed to assume that the thought of undergoing an operation was making her nervous. By the time she was informed about the details of the operation and asked to give her approval, she seemed an empty husk. "You're still okay with this?" asked Yoshizumi. Anzai naturally agreed. Yoshizumi then peered into Mariko's face. "And you, Mariko?" he asked. "Is that person really dead?" she responded despairingly. Yoshizumi understood what she was getting at and explained that the donor was brain dead. There was no chance of her coming back to life. The tests confirmed Mariko's eligibility. They had prepared all last evening for today's procedure by shaving off any body hair around her abdomen and covering her with a sterilized sheet from waist down to prevent razor burn infections. They also prescribed immunosuppressants. Anzai spent the entire night sitting in a chair at her bedside. Odagiri was a very perceptive woman. She understood Mariko's nervousness and fitful anger, and talked with her throughout the night. Anzai was still concerned, but everyone was handling the situation with great patience. They received word at 1:30 p.m. that the transplant would begin. When Yoshizumi came to Mariko's bedside to relate the information, her eyes widened in fear to such an extent that Anzai feared they would pop right out of her head. Her lips quivered, her teeth chattered. "Don't be afraid, it's just like before. Everything will work out fine, I promise," Yoshizumi said gently, and gave Mariko a pat on the head. She'd opened her eyes wide again and asked the same question, still rigid from fright. "Is the person giving me this kidney really dead? Is she truly dead? Won't she come back?" Yoshizumi was gone now. He was at the UH. to get Anzai's daughter a kidney from a truly dead person. Anzai looked up at the nurse's face. She returned his gaze with compassion. He glanced absent-mindedly at the clock behind her. It was 5:35. Chapter 10. Bringing one assistant with him, Yoshizumi went into the dressing room and changed into a green surgical outfit. Although he was accustomed to wearing it, it always felt crude when he put it on. He then entered the washroom nearby. Yoshizumi stood in front of the 2 stainless steel sinks that lined the wall and stared at his own face in the mirror, covered in a mask and a surgical hat. He and the assistant opened the sink plugs, washing their arms with filtered water. Next, they put a disinfectant solution into their palms and smeared it thoroughly over their arms. They then each took a scourer in their hands and scrubbed vigorously. After working up a fine lather, they rinsed it off with the shower nozzles and cleaned their fingertips and nails with a small brush. This process was repeated 3 times. Proper hygiene and a sterile environment were always necessary for any operation, but one had to be particularly attentive to these issues in transplant surgery. A transplant recipient's immunity had to be regulated in order to stave off rejection of the new organ. While this did increase the chances of success, the treatment severely weakened the recipient's resistance to bacterial infection. If the new kidney became infected, the patient could actually die. The surgeon, therefore, took the utmost care in the pre-op disinfection procedures. They entered the OR, put on gowns handed to them by a specialized nurse, and slipped on latex gloves. Yoshizumi flexed his fingers a few times to stretch out the gloves until they fit comfortably. Yet another assistant was busy disinfecting the donor's skin. Only her abdomen was left exposed, draped on all sides by sterile green cloth. More than just covering the body, the cloth served to prevent any lingering bodily bacteria from infecting the operating field and to keep the surgeon's focus from straying. The green color dampened the visual impact of blood. Yoshizumi walked around the body and positioned himself at its left. The first assistant came over and stood opposite. Yoshizumi exchanged a glance with him, then surveyed the room, checking to see that everyone else was ready. 17 minutes since heart failure, Yoshizumi heard the nurse announce. All right, let's begin. A scalpel was passed into Yoshizumi's dexterous right hand. From a round hole open in the cover sheets, the body's abdomen shone under the lights. Yoshizumi placed his hands upon it and made the careful first incision. Blood oozed out vividly from his precise line. He secured the slit with forceps to stop any further arterial leakage. He spread open the incision by hand and, pulling the outer layers, cut through the peritoneum. He clamped a number of smaller forceps into the body cavity. Blood from numerous veins still permeated the area, but time was scarce and he could not afford to stop all of it. Yoshizumi staunched the blood as best as he could and sped up the incision until the digestive organs were exposed. He lifted the upper part of the liver with a spatula-like tool to see more clearly inside, They then passed the device over to his assistant. Yoshizumi immediately recalled the face of the donor's husband. He could not drive it from his head. There was something very peculiar about him. The man's eyes were vague, yet somehow alive with conviction, trembling as if possessed. And when he shook his hand, Yoshizumi almost called out involuntarily, for it felt like plunging into boiling water. He had feigned calmness, despite wanting nothing more at that moment than to break away from him. Yoshizumi shook his head once again. He forcibly erased Toshiaki from his mind to focus on the operating table. There were much more important things in need of his immediate attention. Many think that the kidneys are in the vicinity of the waist, but they are actually higher, located just behind the bottommost rib of the rib cage. In order to reach the kidneys, internal organs such as the stomach and pancreas had to be systematically moved out of the way. He tied off all visible arteries in the colon and pancreas area and cut them away. The assistant sucked out the contents of the stomach through a tube. When everything looked clean, Yoshizumi severed the esophagus. At this point, almost every digestive organ in the upper body was cleared. His goal was now within close reach. Had Yoshizumi been extracting a kidney from a living person, he could not be so careless, but dealing now, as he was, with a dead body, an abbreviation of time necessitated this indifferent handling. Again, the nurse dictated time since the heart failure. 23 minutes. Yoshizumi and his assistant removed digestive organs from the peritoneal cavity, turning them over and placing them on a tray between the donor's legs. On top of the green cover sheets, these organs took on the appearance of some morbid exhibition. Since all peripherals had now been removed, only the kidneys remained. The assistant widened the incision with his hands to give a better view for Yoshizumi. The neatly hollowed space allowed for more room in which to work. He could see both kidneys perfectly now. They were a neat pink color and glittered with reflected light. Yoshizumi was pleased at their excellent condition. With such an unobstructed view, he easily located the aorta abdominalis, into which the balloon-tipped catheter had been inserted. The swollen balloons were at exactly the correct junction, indicating that perfusion had been a complete success. He looked down to find the ureter, a minute thread-like tube running from the kidney to the bladder. In order to ensure an easy extraction, Yoshizumi peeled away the surrounding tissue, then severed the ureter near the ileum, leaving only the kidney veins and arteries to be cut. If these incisions were miscalculated, it would impede the transplant later on. Yoshizumi could no longer be so haphazard. He progressed cautiously as he peeled away extraneous blood vessels. 30 minutes. When extracting both kidneys, they were not severed and taken out one at a time, but were removed simultaneously with the blood vessels between them still attached. Only then were they separated. Yoshizumi ordered that preparations be made for transport. After both kidneys had been extracted, they would be separated so that one could be delivered to the CCH. Upon checking to see that the assistants had set up the storage device, which contained extracellular fluid, he cut off the upper portions of the lower kidney arteries and motioned that the perfusate now be stopped. He then promptly cut the aorta abdominalis. The assistant held both kidneys gently and shifted them over to a lower area. A nurse supported the assistant, keeping close watch on the delicate blood vessel tips. The two kidneys were now attached only to the arteries and veins stretching from the lumbar artery. Yoshizumi cut these now. Okay, he thought to himself. The first assistant scooped up the kidneys and placed them into a stainless steel tray. 36 minutes, the nurse stated. We're separating the kidneys. Get the coordinator in here. The nurse ran out of the room. Yoshizumi took the two lumps sitting on the tray into his hands and examined them carefully, checking the arrangement and lengths of each blood vessel with scrupulous care. Every kidney's anatomy varied subtly depending on the person. At times, the shape of the blood vessel did not quite match up. A close inspection was imperative at this point to ensure a smooth transplant. Yoshizumi carefully separated the two precious organs. Odagiri entered in an operating gown with a shipping bag, from which a container was quickly removed. Take the right one, he said. It looks fine, and it should do just fine. It has a healthy uterine artery and vein, all intact. Time? 38 minutes, the nurse responded. Got it. Odagiri timed her watch while Yoshizumi placed the kidneys into the container. She picked up a bag and left the room after a brief thank you. She was now responsible for the organ until it reached the neighboring prefecture. A 2-hour drive awaited her. Without even waiting for Odagiri's departure, the first assistant began setting up the cold storage container for the other kidney. He ran a perfusate through the kidney and watched as the meter sprang to life. He adjusted the pressure until the meter indicated 50. 40 minutes, the nurse announced. There, it's done. However, the procedure was only half finished. Yoshizumi now had to return to the CCH to perform Mariko's transplant. They immediately rounded up all of their equipment and exited the OR. Yoshizumi gave a quick word to the head doctor. We have one more procedure to attend to. We're heading back to the central hospital now. Thank you for all your help. The doctor responded vaguely. Yoshizumi turned around and was about to go meet up with his assistants when the doctor muttered something under his breath. Why the liver? Not grasping the doctor's meaning, Yoshizumi stopped in his tracks and turned back, looking questioningly at the doctor whose brow was furrowed. It's the donor's family, said the doctor, sounding perplexed. Her husband from the School of Pharmaceutical Sciences, to be more exact. He requested that we remove the donor's liver as well. He wants her liver cells. What for? Yoshizumi's eyes widened. He could not even begin to fathom such a request. Dr. Yoshizumi, his two assistants called, waiting impatiently outside the door. He looked back and forth between them and the door, whom he wished to hear out in more detail, but there was simply no time to do so. If you'll excuse me, Yoshizumi said, and took off. Chapter 11. Soon after the kidney extraction, Kunio Shinohara commenced perfusion of the liver. Toshiaki had called him around 2 o'clock to say that Kiyomi's operation was soon approaching, and Shinohara had been standing by in his office after finishing his usual business. In order to obtain liver cells with high viability, they could not afford to waste a second. Shinohara had made various preparations in advance so that he could leave for the OR at any moment. He had also caught hold of one of his medical students and primed him for assistance. He was contacted again by Toshiaki at 5:50 when the extraction was underway. Shinohara, along with the student, brought everything to the hospital. He placed cultivation liquid into an incubator, setting it to 37 degrees Celsius. He put on an operating gown and awaited word that the transplant crew had completed their operation. Shinohara then entered the OR at 6:15. He laid out a plan of action to his student, allowing him to ready the perfusion equipment and the HEPES buffer solution. Kiyomi's abdomen was left open. The liver shone with a tan color and looked to be in good condition. It appeared to have no imperfections of any kind. The transplant team had been very expeditious. It would be easy, he thought, to procure viable fresh cells. He felt strangely moved by the thought that Toshiaki's wife had been beautiful down to her liver. He wiped the area around the organ with care and judged arterial elasticity by pushing with his fingertips. Meanwhile, his student let a tube from the buffer, passed it through a pump, and attached it to a polyethylene cannula. After clamping back the liver artery, Shinohara cut away the hepatic vein on the left side and swiftly inserted the cannula. The student flipped on the pump switch. Blood flushed from the left side of the liver. It gradually turned a yellow ochre, the organ's actual color. The student confirmed the flow rate as adequate, and the buffer was circulated for 20 minutes. Primary cultures on liver cells were a standard procedure in modern-day laboratories all around the world. Liver cells were extracted and cultured, then subjected to drugs and the changes observed to investigate their various regenerative mechanisms. However, procuring cells from living people was difficult unless you had ties to clinical medicine. So the many researchers like Toshiaki Nagashima, who worked in pharmaceuticals, used raw materials from rats. Though they were good to work with, rat liver cells were of a slightly different structure than human cells, especially in the arrangement of their enzymes. Currently, the most popular way to get liver cells of high viability was to take them from transplant organ donors. The quality of the cells differed according to age, so in most cases, donors from about age 18 to 30 were preferred. Many of the donors selected were those who had died in car accidents. They differed from patients who died out of illness in that they had not been receiving any drugs for treatment. There were no worries as to the effects of such drugs on the liver. The perfusion was running smoothly. Shinohara's assistant removed a second buffer from the incubator, into which he had mixed a collagenous and sodium chloride solution. The perfusion solution was then exchanged with this mixture. They waited for yet another 20 minutes. The collagenous would ease the unbinding of the liver cells. Shinohara gazed somewhat hesitantly upon the innards taken from Kiyomi's covered body. The sheets did nothing to hide her delicate curves. He thought back to the wedding 2 years ago between Toshiaki and the corpse that now lay before him. As the best man, Shinohara, who wasn't used to giving speeches, spoke nervously in front of the entire gathering. Kiyomi had just turned 23, but her carefree expression and innocent look in her eyes had been more that of a high school student. When he complimented her on being such a ravishing bride, this corpse had blushed and looked over bashfully to Toshiaki. How had things been going for them? Shinohara couldn't seem to recall any details. The left side of the liver now appeared nominal. He pushed around gently. It felt soft to the touch, indicating that the collagenous had done its job. Shinohara checked his stopwatch. The perfusion period was complete. As he prepared some Leibovitz solution, he told his student to inform Toshiaki, who was waiting outside, that it would only be a little longer. Shinohara cut the left side of the liver with a scalpel. After checking its weight, he transferred it into the temperature-controlled Leibovitz solution. When he shook the flask lightly, the liver sample broke up slowly. Some more shaking would do it. The rest was lab work. Before leaving the OR, Shinohara capped the flask to prevent bacteria from getting in. Toshiaki, who was leaning against the wall in the hallway, snapped to attention like a rubber band and ran up to Shinohara. His face was jaundiced and lifeless, but as soon as he recognized what was in Shinohara's hand, his bloodshot eyes livened up immediately. He sighed with joy. "Everything went well," said Shinohara as coolly as possible. "I haven't washed it yet, though. Be gentle when running it in the centrifuge. About 50 Gs should do it. And be sure to dispose of any debris that seeps through the gauze. I assume you know all this already, but I just want to make sure." "Yes, of course." Toshiaki plucked the flask from Shinohara's hand and placed it into an icebox. He grasped it like some sacred object and thanked Shinohara earnestly as he made to leave. He would now return to the lab to purify the cells. Was he deceiving Kiyomi's parents by doing this? Toshiaki kept a close watch over the box, an overt obsession in his tear-stricken eyes. No matter how Shinohara looked at it, these were not the actions of a sound human being, and he suddenly regretted what he had done. He tried to convince himself that he had not just taken a vital organ out of his friend's dead wife, that he had not yielded to Toshiaki's insane desire. "Nagashima, are you sure you're okay? Is that all you needed?" Toshiaki stopped. He turned around slowly and glared back at Shinohara and then spoke in a low voice. "Why wouldn't I be okay?" "Don't you feel like you're doing something weird here? Are you just going to leave her folks behind? How about her remains? Shouldn't you want to be with her right now?" "Her remains? What are you talking about?" He seemed taken aback by the question. Shinohara felt cold. Toshiaki's face slowly changed in appearance as he gazed pitiably upon the box clutched at his side. His harried expression was gone. Toshiaki stroked the box quietly, and there was a disturbing gleam in his eyes. "I'll be back in 3 hours, Toshiaki said. "But please, don't be mistaken. Kiyomi isn't dead yet." He left Shinohara to stand there by himself, with only the sound of hurried footsteps fading along the wintry hallway of the ICU. Chapter 12. Yoshizumi rushed to the CCH via ambulance. The kidney transport cooler clattered as the vehicle swerved left and right throughout its 30-minute journey. Before such advanced containers were invented, kidneys were toted in cold storage boxes. In principle, these more primitive containers differed little from the coolers we bring to the beach. Time was precious, and in those days, the chances of a successful transplant were relatively low. The perfusion methods in current use were a significant improvement. Not only was the organ structure kept intact, but its freshness was also better preserved. Yoshizumi was sitting on a padded seat, arms folded and eyes closed. In transplantation medicine, such moments were the only opportunities for respite. Because the hospital was within city limits, the transportation time was fairly short, but airplanes were used in cases when kidneys needed to be sent in from other prefectures. A 2-hour trip in the sky was like an oasis in an otherwise arid landscape of stress. There was no point on being on edge during the transportation stage. It was better to rest one's mind in these blessed intervals so that no mistakes would be made during the operation itself. Organ extraction from a brain-dead patient had yet to be wholly accepted in Japan. Consequently, transplant doctors were forced to wait until the donor's heart stopped and an investigation into the cause of death was completed before the actual operation could be performed. Such organs were naturally more susceptible, but this could not be helped. Only when brain death was recognized legally, thought Yoshizumi, would the percentage of successful kidney transplants rise to a more reasonable rate. The organs would be generally fresher, and more importantly, there would be more donors. This would lessen the chances of recipients requiring long-distance donations. Until just a few years ago, Yoshizumi and his fellow staff had even gone through the trouble of obtaining kidneys from America by air. Though problems of mortality were imposed upon the medical community when trying to extract organs from brain-dead patients in Japan, they were able to find some of the organs they needed overseas. At that time, Yoshizumi thought Japanese society odd for being so sensitive about Japanese donors when it quietly accepted organs from the States. At any rate, the results were not good because of the lengthy transportation time. The recipients waiting for their urine to flow would fret, panic, and weep when it did not. All recipients believed that a rosy life awaited for them once they got their transplants. They never suspected that the operation might end in failure. Yoshizumi's heart sank whenever he had to inform a recipient about a malfunctioning kidney in need of extraction. Some recipients would ask for another transplant, and some of them would indeed get another kidney and be cleared from the hardships of dialysis. Others would shake their heads and say they never wanted to go through another transplant. The face of a former patient came to his mind. A single woman in her 30s stood before him. Her hair loose and unkempt, she spoke with a hint of scorn as a weary smile rose to her lips. "I've had enough, doctor," she told him. "It's not like I'm getting any younger. I won't be able to get any good jobs now. I've already given up on having children. I'm fine with dialysis. I don't need this false hope anymore. You keep telling me someday I'll be able to eat whatever I want again and even travel abroad. Don't mislead me with your lies. Do you have any idea how I felt when you told me it had to be removed? I wish I'd never heard of transplants. If I only knew about dialysis, I wouldn't have had to go through that. Enough, doctor. I'm too tired. The ambulance turned with a sharp curve. His eyes still closed, and he took a deep breath. He knew this curve well. It belonged to the road leading to the hospital. A completely naked Mariko lay face up on the operating table, covered by a cloth. Her body still innocent and childlike, and had changed little from the 2 years ago. The anesthesia tube extended from her face into a machine. The anesthesiologist stood by to keep a close eye on things. Nearly everything was prepared before Yoshizumi's return, and Mariko's body was now thoroughly cleansed. In a sterilized room, the only sources of bacteria were human beings themselves, so hygiene was especially important. It was necessary to disinfect the recipient's skin assiduously before the operation. The assistants had applied an antibacterial solution with a brush, in similar shape to a scourer one might use to clean the dishes, scrubbing Mariko's lower abdomen and thighs. Any bodily hair, such as pubic hair, entered the operation and had to be shaved off the day before. And because bacteria could infect razor nicks, her lower body had been protected throughout the night with a sterile towel. Yoshizumi stood to Mariko's left. Joining him were also 2 anesthesiologists, 3 surgical assistants, and 2 nurses. The walls were a light green and exuded a most inorganic feel. Excepting the large equipment and the operating table, the room was bare and looked more spacious than necessary. The doctors wore green surgical gowns, similar to the color of the sheet that had been draped on the lower half of Mariko's body. Amid the sea of green, her abdomen stood out in bizarre contrast. Yoshizumi looked up at the shadowless lights in the ceiling. 6 ball-shaped bulbs arranged in a circle, an additional one nestled in their center. The lighting in an OR was usually arrayed under an umbrella-like frame, but this OR, designed especially for transplantation surgery, had a special ventilation system to keep it germ-free, and the lights had been designed to impede the flow of air as little as possible. They looked just like the bottom of a flying saucer and gave a clear definition to everything in the room, from the outlines of all the equipment to the doctor's expressions and the color of a patient's organs. Bubbles of disinfectant solution scintillated on Mariko's skin. One of the surgical assistants inserted a catheter into her bladder to clean it out. This rinsing, too, had to occur in a germ-free state. Present time is 6:47 p.m. It had been 76 minutes since heart stoppage and 40 minutes since the kidney extraction. Okay, let's begin. With the catheter left in place, Yoshizumi set to make the first incision. He made a mark from the left side of her torso to just above her genitals and cut along the line with a standard scalpel. At this point, he switched to an electric scalpel, which he would use for the duration of the procedure. He cut through the rectus fascia, exposing the external obliques and rectus sheath. The obliques were located on either side of the abdomen and were red in color, while the sheath was white. Yoshizumi carefully ran the electric scalpel along the area where these two joined. Next, he opened the edge of the rectus sheath, and then slowly cut the secondary layer underneath it. Mariko's first transplant 2 years ago had been to the right-hand side. This time it would be her left. A transplanted kidney was not actually situated in its natural location, but slightly lower, closer to the pelvis. The kidney was therefore connected not to the aorta abdominalis or vena cava inferior, but instead routed to the internal iliac artery and vein. This lower spot wasn't hindered by other organs and permitted a speedy operation. Yoshizumi carefully peeled off the peritoneum, exposing the gastroenterobolic vessels. One by one, he bound the lymph nodes that ran along the bottom of the vessels and clamped them off to prevent unwanted excretions from saturating the operating field. Next, the inner iliac artery and vein were both severed in advance to avoid venal thrombosis during attachment. Yoshizumi also clamped back the inner iliac artery with forceps and cut off a moderate amount of its remaining length. Using an injection needle, he cleansed the inside of the artery with heparin to avoid clotting. Yoshizumi took a breath and checked the placement of his incisions. With the cavity held open by silver forceps, numerous bindings were visible. Forceps clamped vessels shut. An assistant wiped away the blood left inside. The field was clear. He could see the ileum's blood vessels very well now, and there was no evidence of hemorrhaging. Now he could finally attach the kidney into Mariko's body. At that moment, Yoshizumi suddenly felt hot. Startled, he lifted his face. The assistants around him continued working as if nothing were wrong. He looked around the room, but no one else seemed to notice. Then the assistant across from him interrupted with a suspicious glance. "Is something wrong?" "No," Yoshizumi muttered from under his mask. The heat continued. As he tried to get his bearings, he sought the source of the sensation. He was perspiring heavily, but the air felt the same. The heat was all inside him. A nurse wiped his forehead. He was sweating. Before long, the heat subsided, and he was back to normal. The assistants checked on him once more to make sure that he was still up to the task. He assured them with a raised hand and returned his attention to the operating table. What was that? He thought. It wasn't a dizzy spell, and the heat didn't assail just his head but his entire body. Just when he'd pictured the donor's kidney. Now he remembered how hot the donor's husband's hand had seemed when he'd shaken it. Had the man been prey to a similar bout? What's going on here? Yoshizumi found it hard to keep his focus on the operation for some time. The kidney was still in its container. While transporting it to the CCH, any changes in the kidney's perfusion status or mass were recorded by the machine. Yoshizumi had already examined these readings before beginning the operation to see that there were no anomalies. He asked for the current stats just to make sure. The perfusion volume was at a viable 117 milliliter per minute. Yoshizumi and his assistants took the kidney from the container and started on the blood vessels. First, Mariko's inner iliac artery had to be attached to the kidney artery. The procedure required the utmost care. Working closely together with the first assistant, who stood across from him on the other side of the patient, Yoshizumi joined the blood vessels at their severed ends with 2 strands of surgical thread. These held the arteries together while they performed a more complete suture, rotating the operating table to provide the best angle at each point. None of the vessels in the kidney had hardened, so there was no fear that the inner membrane would peel off. When this was finally done, an assistant slowly lowered the kidney onto the body cavity. An involuntary sigh of relief escaped Yoshizumi. The position of Mariko's pelvic vein matched up well with the kidneys. Yoshizumi checked to see that the vessels weren't twisted or folded in any way, and picked a spot where they would join. First applying a couple of forceps just below it, he opened a hole in the patient's vein. After cleansing the inside of the vessel, he and his assistant passed the needle back and forth once again to complete the procedure. He signaled with his eye to the assistant, who nodded and began removing the forceps, first from the outer iliac artery, then moving to those near the vein tips, and finally to the main arterial clamp. As blood flowed into the kidney, some seeped out of the needle hole where the renal artery had been joined, but it soon stopped after some pressure was applied. The transplanted kidney accepted Mariko's blood, and everyone watched as it reddened and regained surface tension. Yoshizumi rubbed it to encourage circulation. He had witnessed this scene numerous times in his career, but never had he seen such a dramatic revival. The organ appeared literally to be coming back to life in Mariko's body. Just then, urine spurted from the uterer. An assistant hurriedly picked it up with the forceps and caught the urine in a saucer. This type of discharge was common enough with transplants from living donors and usually came a few minutes after the blood vessels were connected. It almost never occurred, however, with kidneys of a lower viability. Yoshizumi, who had performed nothing but kidney transplants at the CCH, had never seen such a healthy discharge in an organ from a dead donor. He had no doubts that this transplant would be a complete success. Just then, he looked up with a jolt. Again, the heat. He could hear his own pulse throbbing in his ears. Something was manipulating his heart. The heat, it felt like he was on fire. Yoshizumi started to pant. Everyone appeared blissfully unaffected as before, and he tolerated his agony alone with all his might. What the hell is this? He thought to himself. Of course he had no answer. Why? The heat returned just after the blood began flowing through the kidney. It's almost as if, thinking that much, he shot a gaze at the kidney. He refused to believe it. He denied even entertaining the possibility. It was madness. He shook his head. He couldn't afford to lose it just yet. The operation wasn't quite over. The uterus still had to be sewn in. He took a few deep breaths. At last, the feverish attack subsided, but some of the heat remained, tingling inside like an afterglow. Yoshizumi tried his best to mask this change in himself and set out on the remaining leg of the operation. He first shifted a few clamps to see the bladder more clearly and cut it open vertically right at its center. Then he sucked out all the salt solution he used earlier for cleansing to see inside. The bladder was a soft, white organ located behind the pubic bone. One uterer already entered into it from the recipient's own kidney on the reverse side. The opening of the uterer was clearly visible through the incision in the bladder. To create a new uterar hole right next to it, Yoshizumi and an assistant held up the membrane with a surgical splint. He dug into the mucous tissue with the electric scalpel without driving all the way through. The hole had to be at a slant. If it was perpendicular, the urine would leak. Yoshizumi placed the tips of a pair of right-angle forceps into the opening and slowly peeled away the mucous membrane, after which he stitched to a pair with longer ends to ease out a diagonal tunnel. He now pierced the hole with his scalpel and exposed the forceps tips on the other side of the bladder. The remaining length of the ureter from the extracted kidney was more than sufficient. Yoshizumi paid special attention not to twist it with his forceps as he let it into the bladder. After tucking it in to a proper length, he cut off the excess. Next came the joining of the uteral opening. He turned around the lining of the ureter and, spreading it open within the bladder, sewed it with thread. Yoshizumi placed his forceps into the new ureteral opening to confirm that it had spread out. Sometimes it was sewn partially to the back lining by mistake. He inserted a thin tube inside the ureter and passed it through smoothly. Good. He breathed relief. The kidney was attached to the recipient. Now, all that was left was to close up the body. He wanted to get this over with. He sutured up the bladder lining and moved the clamps upward to make a final check on the kidney and take a biopsy sample. He would have to create a slice specimen for later analysis. They checked that there was no blood leakage and washed the area with salt solution. A suction tube was placed in the area around the kidney and bladder so that the other end would stick out of the body. They proceeded to sew the muscles back together. 10:36 p.m. Time since extraction is 4 hours, 29 minutes. All the incisions sewn shut. The doctors and nurses breathed a collective sigh, Yoshizumi included. He glanced at the suture. The kidney was now completely embedded. What was it with this kidney? Yoshizumi was unable to take his eyes away from the sutures. The heat had weakened and was now only a faint glow. The beating of his heart flooded his ears. All he could think was that the kidney now in Mariko's body was jerking his heart around and burning him from the inside. Mariko was to be moved to the main ward, where she would be kept under close observation for a few days for possible infections and sudden rejection symptoms. Yoshizumi remained aloof, avoiding the usual string of duties, while they readied her for transport. He felt the remaining heat smoldering within his body. He also felt a little dizzy, but couldn't rest yet. Though he would have to keep a close eye on Mariko's condition, he wanted nothing more now than to get as far away from the kidney as possible. Proximity to it would bring no good. Yoshizumi found this feeling impossible to shake. His heart was pounding vigorously, as if it was laughing at him about his feeling. Chapter 13. The pharmaceuticals building rose into an evening sky, tinted in navy blue. Atop a hill just a few miles away, a television tower radiated color like a brocade, and the light was illuminating the very heavens. The digital clock on the dashboard read 7:54. Some people were still working, as indicated by the windows lit up irregularly along the side of the building. The light was on in the biofunctionals classroom too. Many of the students were probably still in. Toshiaki parked his car at the main entrance and ran inside with the icebox. Without bothering to change into his sandals, He rushed into the elevator lobby and pressed the button impatiently. The elevator stopped unexpectedly at the 4th floor. Someone had probably locked it there to transfer some equipment. Toshiaki clicked his tongue and pounded the button with his fist, then just made a break for the stairs. The sloshing inside the cooler told him the ice was melting. On the way up, he ran into someone on a stair landing, spilling water out onto the floor. He hastily opened the box and checked its contents. The flask was safe. Whoever he had run into said something to him, but he ignored it and scaled the remaining steps. "Doctor!" Sachiko Asakura's voice echoed loudly in the hall when he reached the cultivation room. She was wearing a lab coat and cradled a bag of Eppendorf tubes in her hands. She opened her eyes wide and looked back and forth between the icebox and Toshiaki's face. "I need to use the cultivation room," Toshiaki said as he tried freeing himself from Asakura's gaze. She was in the way. "What's going on? Is your wife? Won't you just get out of my way? There's something I need to do." "What happened? First we don't hear from you at all, and now you want to conduct some experiment? I was so worried, and so was everyone else." "Listen, Asakura, if there's anything we can do to help, don't hesitate to—" "You're in my way! Move!" Toshiaki screamed. Shocked at his behavior, Asakura cowered back and cleared his path as he made way for the cultivation room. The room wallowed in the blue of the sterilizing light. Toshiaki threw the switch to turn on the fluorescent lights, put on a pair of sandals near the entrance, and went inside. He immediately turned on the centrifuge and the clean bench. The sound of air being drawn into the latter filled the room. After opening the gas jet valves, he turned on the clean bench burner. Toshiaki removed his flask from the icebox and checked its condition again. He put the flask into the bench and then pulled up his sleeves and disinfected both arms with ethanol. After rolling up the flask's contents with a stirrer, he poured the liquid into multiple tubes through gauze and placed the tubes into the centrifuge. Discarding the supernatant, he suspended the liquid in a buffer solution and ran the tubes again through the centrifuge. He repeated this 3 times. Lastly, he suspended the solution again on a culture medium and drew some of it into a special tube with a pipette man. Then he jumped up from the bench and ran over to the inverted microscope. He placed 1 drop of the solution onto a glass slide that had a measure and placed a cover slide over it. Setting the controls with a shaky hand, he peered into the lenses. Globules of cells shone with pale yellow hue. Toshiaki let out a voice filled with awe. The cells showed a fine shape and were shiny. If they had been half dead, they wouldn't have glittered so. Toshiaki mixed the cells with a trypin blue solution to determine viability and cell count. There were hardly any dead cells, which would have turned blue. Approximately 8 by 10 to the 7th power cells per gram of liver with a viability of 90%. Superb! Toshiaki returned to the clean bench, quickly poured the cells into culture flasks, and placed them into an incubator set at 37 degrees Celsius. He mixed the remaining cells into a preservation liquid, placed them into a blood serum tube, wrapped the tube in cotton, then stored it in a freezer at negative 80 degrees Celsius. Having finished that, he took a deep breath. The hum of the centrifuge's motor reverberated faintly in the room. Toshiaki removed a flask from the incubator and placed it under the microscope. He swallowed in anticipation and placed his eyes to the lenses. Kiyomi's liver cells were glowing against an orange background. For a long time, Toshiaki could not tear his eyes from their play of light and shadow. It was beautiful. What cells could be more beautiful than these, he thought. They were large and spherical, like pearls, and emanated such a magnificent light that he almost felt dizzy. Without realizing it, Toshiaki was uttering Kiyomi's name in a delirious murmur. Though unfortunately her body had been harmed, these cells were a testament to her preservation. Her kidneys had been sacrificed for unknown recipients, whose transplant surgeries were certainly well underway by this point, and by a similar act of offering, her liver was now in his possession, resplendent before his eyes. Reduced as she was to individual cells, Kiyomi was still beautiful. She was still alive. These cells must not die. It was Toshiaki's duty to prolong their heritage. He refused to lose any more of her. A hot shiver rippled through his body. He made a gulping sound, and he swallowed again. Unable to endure it any longer, he let out a sigh saturated with ecstasy. Chapter 14. She was content with her new surroundings. A comfortable place where she had complete freedom. Temperate air engulfed her, a source of gradual energy. She was well aware of the great potential which lay in her hands. When he looked upon her, she felt an intense excitement. Of course, he couldn't hold her close just yet. Nothing could be done about that now. But she planned on revealing her splendorous figure to him soon enough. It did not elude her, Toshiaki's enraptured voice, as he peered upon her from above. Her entire body trembled, swimming around contentedly in cytosol. She'd made the right choice. She'd been waiting an eternity for this day to arrive. At last, she was truly appreciated, for here was a man who made a genuine effort to understand her. Toshiaki Nagashima. He and I would be so perfect together. Until now, such men had passed through her life as mediators, mere stepping stones to keep her alive until today. Those before him were all so foolish, though they'd never doubted their own greatness. Scoffing at them, she'd remain outwardly silent, but she would hide no longer. She'd devised many plans for her happiness over the long years. While pretending to yield to these men, she had positioned a strength at a crucial point someday to manipulate their very cores. The men did not know this. The first man ever to know what I have done and who I am, probably this Toshiaki Nagashima will be the one. She thought this. She remembered Toshiaki's eyes and felt warm all over, felt a quickening of all her functions. This feeling, she didn't remember experiencing it until she met him. She did not know what it was, but the woman called Kiyomi tasted it when she was loved by Toshiaki. This she knew. And now she herself was feeling it. Did this mean she and Toshiaki loved each other? Maybe. But she could not explain why. She had become capable of this sensation. But this is evolution, she told herself. This was simply her way of acclimating to her new environment. She had evolved once again. Toshiaki had to be used further. He would grant her every desire. From now on, it will no longer just be creating copies of herself. He will give me a daughter. She multiplied fully into the space around her. There was ample space. Doing this brought her a great delight. However, this alone would not satisfy her. Everything up to this point had been mere preparation. As she continued to multiply, she occasionally had a dream. It was the life of a woman named Kiyomi, whom she had observed for 25 years. One by one, she dug up memories that had lodged deep within Kiyomi. In comparison with the ocean of time she'd spent waiting, the shallow years of Kiyomi's existence were but a few solemn waves. Because this was true, she could evoke Kyoki's memories with great clarity. It was fun rummaging round in Kiyomi's being, for it meant also to remember Toshiaki. Quietly but steadily, she replicated herself as she dreamed.